A lot of them are coming from liquid restaking tokens. And one kind of amazing thing is that no matter how many times people call something a ticket or a point or a random incentive that you don't know what it is, there's still a lot of different things going on under the hood of LRTs and how they'll interact with AVSs. And so I think, I want to say like a month ago, Mike randomly messaged me and was like, hey, do you want to write about LRTs? And I was like, yeah, we've been spending much time trying to model some of the things people are doing. And the idea here is like to just give a high-level overview of like, from the perspective of a person building an AVS, what kind of risks are involved that come from LRTs and how you should think about, as you're designing these systems, the risks that you can control or mitigate. All right. So the goal of this talk is, again, there's no math, so it's like only words. So I wanted to give a disclaimer so that people don't yell at me. Okay, so what are LRTs? So liquid restaking tokens are basically a way to create aggregate positions over AVSs. One reason you may want to do this is, if you've looked at the current eigenpod structure, you sort of have a one-to-one mapping of eigenpods to AVSs. You kind of can't deposit ETH and be part of multiple AVSs, and maybe, for a particular risk profile that you have, you may want to have only 50% of your exposure to restaking be from rollups, 25% to MEV, 25% to advanced cryptography. So why do people want this? Well, sort of akin to liquid staking tokens like stETH, people just want to set it and forget it. And AVS selection, even though right now, of course, we're playing the game of point selection, but once AVSs are live, AVS selection is actually hard because some of these AVSs may have really complicated slashing rules. Those slashing rules could lead to a loss of principal very quickly. And the average user sort of wants some type of portfolio of these such that they have some bounds on how much loss they might take. The second thing is people don't want to run nodes. I know that's a blasphemous thing to say, but it's just a fact of nature that we've observed in practice, where no one wants to deal with the DevOps of making sure you have 5 nines of uptime to not get slashed for missing a slot. No one wants to get penalized for missing a vote. And LRTs allow you to get exposure to this entire world of new yield without needing to manage some of this risk yourself, again, like LSTs. And finally, the current set of AVS positions that exist, well, namely the null AVS, which is just the main eigenlayer restaking contract, is like the beacon chain prior to the merge, right? It's a non-fungible position. People may have liquidity needs. They may have lost a lot of money in other poor decisions they made, and they need some liquidity. And so the nice thing about LRTs is you can use them in DeFi. Now, of course, they need to have sufficient liquidity for that to be safe. So, but yes, these are not risk-free things. Like each of those activities has some risk to the end user. It has some risk from the perspective of an AVS because your slashing rules, your choice of how you do payments impacts the outcome of the LRT. Okay. So what's the goal of this talk? So the main idea is to sort of think about the highest key risk metrics and really understanding like which dimensions are more risky than others. I mean, the dad joke is like the eigendimensions of the set of possible risks. And yeah, if you can figure out what the picture is on the lower left and why it has to do with a particular set of eigenvalues, I'll give you a prize. The second thing is comparing the risks to TradFi. I think at the end of the day, these are, out there esoteric risk products, but they also share a lot of similarities with products that we know in traditional finance, such as bonds, and such as very variable bonds like catastrophe-free bonds like the meme is talking about. So what are the assets we have to think about? So I think the first thing to think about is like, in this world of restaking, what do we think about as the fungible versus non-fungible assets? So we're going to kind of look at 3 different non-fungible assets and compare and contrast their similarities and differences. So the first is sovereign bonds. So this is bonds issued by a country. They control the money supply, so they can inflate the money supply to pay back their own debt if they need to. In general, we consider sovereign bonds that are non-transferable. In the US, there's actually quite a few types of non-transferable bonds. But even if they are transferable, usually it's very hard to sell a particular single bond. No one wants the January 10th, 2037 maturing bond, right? People are just like, I want something that pays me a coupon every month. And because of that, you can think of a single bond position as being sort of illiquid and non-fungible in some ways. The second non-fungible asset is an L1 staking position. So I've locked some assets into a validator. I'm running the validator. The only way I could really make it liquid is to give you it's to sell my private key. If I do a withdrawal, I have to wait a withdrawal limit. I have to wait in a withdrawal queue. There's uncertainty in that. So in a lot of ways, the L1 staking positions are non-fungible. Obviously, they can redeem to fungible, but you have to pay this duration risk. And then finally, AVS positions also can be thought as non-fungible. They have different conditions for exit, and it depends on a lot of the eigenpod specifications. On the other hand, what are the fungible assets that people talk about in these 3 worlds? So the first one, which we call in this, just for simplicity, bond funds. There's a lot of different types of bond funds. But if you think about it, most people don't buy bonds themselves. They keep their money in a bank, they put their money in a money market fund, they keep their money in a savings account. All of those things are implicitly taking that money and buying bonds somewhere under the covers. But again, you don't know what bonds you're getting. You're not getting the January 10th, 2037 bond. You're getting a coupon of yield, and when I withdraw, I get my principal back. So it's a different abstraction for the end user. And in the same case as liquid staking, these funds have custodians or third parties who manage the individual non-fungible assets and buy and sell those to meet the demand of what people want when they have to redeem. Liquid staking tokens, same thing. ETH holders delegate validation to node operators who earn the yield and pass it back to them. They don't necessarily care which node operator who staked at what time gave them the yield. They just care that they get the yield. And these assets are, of course, amongst the most liquid assets in DeFi. And they really grew because of the long time period for which the beacon chain was not fungible in a lot of ways, which arguably the same might be true for AVSs, right? There's such a long lead time until it's liquid that LRTs will likely grow much faster than kind of the AVS space itself. Liquid restaking tokens, very similar to LSTs, except you're getting a portfolio of AVSs. So you're getting, you might get, let's see, who are the AVS here? You might get a little bit of alt layer, maybe you'll get some Renzo, maybe you'll get some Espresso in some percentage. Those 3 might have 3 different exit conditions. They'll certainly have very different slashing conditions, certainly different payment conditions. So the sort of complexity goes, increases as you go from left to right. Okay. So maybe just to give some timeline, I think because the sort of major events, I guess I'm missing one of the major events, but I'll say it in there. Since 2020, in bonds, liquid staking and liquid restaking are sort of inherently intertwined, in fact. We started with the pandemic, zero interest rate policy, made crypto go up. By the end of the year, we had the Beacon Chain and Lido launch. And within 4 months, Lido hit $1 billion in TVL, which at that time was a huge accomplishment, right? ETH price was, at least 1/8 of where we are now, something like that, 1/7 or 1/8. And within a year of that, Lido reached 30% of stake. Of course, a month later, in May 2022, we had this event where the market which sort of a lot of participants in the market expected these staked assets to trade at par with the underlying, deviated from par due to some large blow-ups of 3 arrows in Celsius. And then we sort of saw, if we look right now, Lido's sort of in this 27 billion TVL range. Eigenlayer and liquid restaking is a much more compressed version of that, as you can see. We're kind of already at 7.5 billion and growing. But the interesting thing is you also see the bond market has these interest rate changes causing failures, with the SVB failure actually sharing a lot of similarities to LRTs, and we'll talk about that more. Mike is going to go way more in depth on that. So let's just go through the risk factors. So the rest of this talk is just kind of going through the high-level risk factors and giving some way of comparing them. So the first risk factor is sort of liquidity and leverage. We kind of bucket them together because it's very hard to take a lot of leverage without much liquidity, because one side of the market won't be willing to offer it as easily. And as we said earlier, the bonds, L1 staking positions, and AVS positions are sort of illiquid. They don't really have implicit leverage anywhere. On the other hand, the fungible assets are liquid and they may have some implied leverage. For instance, if the node operators are levered in order to, in a rocket pool style model where the node operators have to put up some capital, imagine that the node operators borrowed money to pay for their claim for a ticket or a validator in Puffer or rocket pool. Well, they could actually be levered in a way that you don't know. So there's all three of these could implicitly have leverage you haven't realized. The second is yield. So where is the how's the yield paid? And so in the sovereign bond case, it's the sovereign treasury, like the government hitting the print button. And the denomination is in the sovereign currency. So one caveat here, and we mentioned it a little bit in the post, is that a lot of sovereigns in the world actually sell bonds not in their own currency. So for instance, the most famous one is Argentina, who's sold US dollar bonds, then has defaulted on them 3 times. So those are not the type we're comparing to here. The second is L1 staking positions, a very similar thing. The L1 protocol has an inflation curve. The inflation curve is used to fund things, and there's often interaction between the fees and the inflation curve, like EIP 5059. Finally, in the AVS case, we have a much more complicated version of this. The yield is coming from the protocol, so the protocol might be generating variable fees. But as we saw in the previous talk, there are these dual staking models, so there may be some token inflation from the AVS's governance token that gets paid also. And so you actually have a very mixed portfolio of payouts, and you have some basis risk on that. In the fungible case, it's sort of the same thing, what you expect, except just like when you go to your savings account at a bank, the bank tells you, hey, I'm going to pay you 4%. But realistically, the bank owns 1,000 bonds that are paying 5.5%, 2,000 bonds that are paying 3%, and 150 bonds paying 4%, and then they're aggregating and giving you that. That's exactly the same as a sovereign bond fund. LST, the nice thing is, decentralized protocols that have consensus mean everyone can agree on inflation, so you don't have as much disaggregation as you do in the bond fund case. But LRTs, however, bring back the disaggregation because the yield sources are quite varied between the different types of protocols. And by the way, Mike is going to cover yield and duration in more detail, so I'm kind of glossing over a lot, so stay tuned for that. So duration, duration is sort of the first factor where crypto assets and TradFi assets differ a lot in these risk dimensions. Most bonds around the world are fixed to maturity. So I say that there's a certain number of years that I'm going to pay you interest for before I give you back the principal. Mortgages and stuff are different, but for sovereign bonds, this is true. But in L1 and AVS positions, the withdrawal rates are limited by the protocol. So if you think about Ethereum, there's the withdrawal queue. There's only a certain amount of withdrawals that can be processed per epoch. And in the AVS case, you actually have withdrawals that could be limited by the AVS plus the L1. So the AVS may before it hits the eigenpod contract, there might be extra logic that slows withdrawals, like a double queue system. So that's a risk that these are taking. And the liquid versions of all of these just simply have the extra risk of your custodian/node operator may not be able to process due to some issue. And the liquid protocols should have some type of skin in the game rule, like some type of slashing rule if an operator doesn't withdraw on time, stuff like that. And there's a lot of devil in the detail of how to do this. I think EIP 7002 is about the nuances of this. Okay. We only have 2 more of these, so don't worry. Risk factor 4 is the default or slashing conditions. Sovereign bond case, no fault. The sovereign controls the money supply. Again, only if you're issuing bonds in your own currency. Ask Argentina for examples of what happens otherwise. In the L1 staking position, default is slashing where some or all the principal is destroyed. But usually, for the most part, L1 slashing events are sort of uncorrelated-ish. You don't see a ton of correlated slashing events where one slash causes someone else to get slashed, causes someone else to get slashed. They're generally relatively independent. There have been a couple instances in Cosmos in particular of correlated slashing events, but that were bad. But I would say it's generally a lower risk. In the AVS case, you have to take both the AVS slashing rules and the L1 slashing rules, and they can be correlated to each other, because exactly at the time that the AVS gets slashed may also be the time that the operator doesn't vote in L1 and misses. They might be getting DDoS, so they're getting slashed in both. And that correlation can actually be a compounding effect on your principal in the worst case. And the liquid ones inherit the default and slashing conditions, with the caveat that the LRTs have many different slashing conditions interacting. Each AVS has a slashing condition. So let's say I take 3 different AVSs, but it turns out that all 3 of them, when Ethereum goes down 20% on Binance, all 3 of them have AVS slashes. Let's say that there's some reason for that. Well, you're actually getting a much worse compounding effect of the slashes in such a case. So the LRTs have sort of this extra thing you have to worry about in terms of the interactions between these. And finally, portfolio selection. So the non-fungible assets, I mean, kind of easy. If you hold an AVS position, you just hold that single AVS position. Same with the other one. Bond funds, generally low complexity. So this is, again, sovereign bond funds. Obviously, things that are mortgage-backed securities, corporate bond funds, all of that are not low complexity. But I'm talking about like your savings account. Like the bank account you don't think about. That is that. Liquid staking tokens, medium complexity. You're trusting, in the case of some liquid staking tokens, governance for choosing the set of operators. Like, will they be operators who don't get slashed, or will they be operators who constantly get slashed? Or you're trusting some type, and that's like the Lido case prior to DVT. Or you're trusting something that's like a collateral ratio. Like the validator has some skin in the game. They have to put up some token and some ETH. So this is the puffer rocket pool style thing. Well, an LST rocket pool and puffer for LRTs. And you're sort of trusting that those collateral ratios were set correctly such that you can survive these correlated slashing events. If not, then all bets are off. But generally, I would say more complex than putting your money in a savings account, less complex than doing the basis trade on Binance. And then liquid restaking tokens, there's definitely going to be high complexity. Obviously, right now there's only the null AVS plus points, and so it's really a game of renaming points to 500 different types of points, and then people making liquid equivalents, whatever. But in the LRT case, once the whole network is live, there's a lot of complexity, right? There's this portfolio selection problem of how do I choose which AVSs I allocate to? How do I rebalance across them? Based on the fees that they're earning, do I put more of the LRT's portfolio into that or not? And how do I think about concentration risk? It's almost like a sort of, in some ways, sort of like a kind of like venture-ish portfolio, right? Like you're locking up capital in these things, you can't really redeem it immediately, and you have concentration risk problems, stuff like that. So before I hand it over to Noiter, I think the main things to think about is like as you go down each of these things, as you go from the illiquid to the liquid, you have issues with thinking about, you might get more yield, but also you might have more risk. You might have more duration bottlenecks in dealing with withdrawals. You may also have extra default conditions, especially for LCs and LRTs. And then finally, in the LRT case, you have this portfolio management complexity, which will dominate a lot of the risk. So this is, if there's any picture to remember, just remember this picture. Noiter made all these pictures. I suck at drawing things, so and that's it.
Deal? Cool. Hey everyone. Thanks, Tarun. Great first half of the talk. One kind of funny story about this is we were both trying to get this article done. We were like very much like, let's finish this before Denver. And I think we were both planning on using it as content for this talk. But neither of us knew that we were both talking at the same event. And so then I sent it to Grace and she said, oh, that's what Tarun's talking about. And I was like, okay, we'll go back to back and it'll be fine. So yeah, I'll just kind of highlight a few things. So this will try and bridge the gap between Tarun's talk and my talk. I'll start with the kind of high level view, so starting where he ended. And then I'll do 2 deep dives into what I'm calling focus attributes. The first one being yield, and the second one being the duration. So yeah, I guess this is the same set of pictures. Oh, lots of new friends. The same set of pictures that we were just looking at. So on the left, we have our non-fungible yielding assets. On the right, we have the fungible baskets. And yeah, this is the exact plot that Tarun just showed, so I won't go through it. But yeah, I guess each of these different items here corresponds to one of the attributes that we discussed in the previous 5 tables. So this is kind of like a top-down view. Another way of thinking about it is actually like left to right. So I call this the tale of 2 categories. So we have kind of category 1, category 2, and there's again another way of saying these 5 different attributes is as follows. First, we have this liquefaction and enabling leverage. So when you have one of these positions on the left, they're not very liquid, nor are they very good as collateral for taking leverage. So by moving from the left to the right, you kind of get both of those properties. And again, this is where the yield aggregation comes in, right? You have many different yielding assets that you have to kind of basketize and pull together and aggregate the yield across. Obviously, the LRT yield is the most complicated because it might be denominated in different units of account. It might come at different rates. It might be a lot more variable. And if you're giving interest in a specific token, you have to figure out when to do swaps, and there's just like real devil in the details there. Duration aggregation, again, this is kind of one of the big themes I'll talk about. I'll talk about like these 2 mainly. So I'll leave that for soon. In terms of defaults, yeah, I guess it's kind of in some ways nice that you spread your default risk out over many different entities. But on the other hand, it's like you have this situation where some subset of them might default, causing like a cascading failure, which would be potentially seriously catastrophic. And lastly is this like basketization and management of portfolio that we think is kind of the real key design question around making one of these LRTs that actually works well and lasts and is anti-fragile. So cool. I'll just run through kind of this focused attribute. Again, this is like a little repetitive, but hopefully it drives home the point that like these things are pretty sticky. So again, filling the top row in, we have the yield denominated in the sovereign currency, the L1 token, and the AVS specified token, and the sources are from the what's listed there. And then on the fungible basket side, yeah, I guess talking about this aggregation over feels really important because it's going to be the kind of key thing that you have to manage if you're putting these assets together. So for aggregating over many different duration and interest rate bonds, many node operators for the LSTs, and many AVSs and node operators for the LRTs. So this is actually interesting because there's kind of two levels of node operators here, right? For LRTs, you have node operators who are doing the AVS things, and then they're also staking in the L1 protocol itself. So there's kind of two different ways an LRT could manage this. They could run the node operators themselves for the L1 and for the AVSs, or they could use like an LST, which has its own portfolio construction underneath it. So there's kind of like two different trade-offs you can make. I think it's pretty easy to argue that having unified control over the whole set of node operators would be good for an LRT, and I think some people are saying that LSTs will probably start to look a lot more like LRTs in the future. On the other hand, like Lido has been running for 3 years and is like super liquid. They've clearly have selected a really good set of node operators for the L1 Ethereum protocol, and an LRT could kind of specialize in AVSs outside of the L1, and that might be another reason to just rely on Steth and Lido in the first place. So yeah, high level takeaway specifically for the LRTs is AVS dependent, potentially different units of account than the L1. So if you're holding an LRT and you expect it to pay you like, 5% in ETH denominated yields, even just like swapping all the AVS yields for ETH when redemptions are happening is quite tricky, I think. Yeah, this is what I was saying about multiple AVSs and multiple node operators, and node operators both on the L1 and the AVS level. And this is kind of one of the key design decisions that I think a lot of the LRTs are going to have to think a lot about, and Lido has thought a lot about, which is this idea that you have to decide how much of the capital you're actually deploying, right? So if Lido has like, let's just say 1,000 ETH, they might not put all 1,000 ETH into the beacon chain, because if someone wants to withdraw like 50 ETH, then they'd have to wait the whole withdrawal period for a validator, which could be like on the order of weeks. Obviously, like you don't want to have people wait a week or multiple weeks, so you keep like some set of the capital not deployed to have more like liquid redemption processes. Obviously, the issue here is that if you're less deployed, then you have less yield, and that's kind of the converse of more deployed and more yield. So yeah, this kind of leads really nicely into this next thing that I want to talk about, which is the withdrawal stuff, and this is kind of the duration mismatches that we've been talking about kind of throughout the course of these two talks. So yeah, I say this is what we're all scared of, because in my mind this feels like the real crux of everything. Like there's someone really wants in. Yeah, so just running through these, for the top row it's what we've already seen. Fixed maturity for bonds, withdrawals rate limited by the L1 protocol, and then AVS restaking positions. I actually added one more thing in the meantime since Tarun put his slides together, which is you have rate limiting from the AVS and the L1 protocol, but you also might have rate limiting from the restaking protocol itself. So EigenLayer actually has this where all withdrawals, no matter what, have a 7-day escrow period. So you could have an AVS window that might be like 2 days, then the 7 days of EigenLayer, and then you might have to go through the whole withdrawal queue for Ethereum. So like that whole process could be quite painful in terms of how long it takes. And for LSTs, or sorry, for the basketized things, we have, we have kind of the different durations here. Withdrawals rate limited by the LST and the L1. And then here we have kind of an additional one, which is the LRT. So now we've put together 4 different potential rate limiting bottlenecks for getting your money out, right? Like this is a scary situation. Like it's kind of a crisis of confidence, and there might be like 4 different things that are slowing down the withdrawal of capital from the protocol. So that's kind of the 3 from above, and additionally from the LRT here. And as I mentioned before, for LSTs and LRTs having to decide like how much of the capital they deploy in terms of having some available for withdrawals, that probably will get exhausted very quickly in the case of a mass rush for the exit. And I think I'll talk about, 4 potential rate limiting phases. And another thing that we talk about in the post, which I think is super interesting, is that for these basket goods, there's kind of two ways you can get out, right? You can sell, like just go to the market and say, I want out. And since they're liquid, like you can do that. Obviously, you take the discount of like the amount of time that people expect it to take to get liquidity on that position. But potentially that might be like totally worth it, especially if you need that capital to like repay a loan or cover margin or something like that. And that's kind of like the short version of withdrawal. And that's like how you get your money out as quickly as possible. The long version of the withdrawal is kind of where it gets this whole 4 bottleneck thing that we described before. And also it's interesting because especially if you're deploying into an LRT, it kind of depends what the people are putting into the LRT that you're actually giving them a withdrawal for. So it could be that they just want to withdraw into stETH, in which case you don't have to actually do the full Ethereum L1 withdrawal because you're not exiting the stETH position at all. But if they actually want like raw ETH out, like the unadulterated pure ETH, then you have like the 4 bottlenecks that we described before, the longest probably being the L1 protocol and the restaking protocol itself. Right. Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say there, which is there's kind of like a full withdrawal versus an LST withdrawal. In the future, I think it's very likely that you might be able to denominate like non-ETH based coins into a restaking protocol. So like there's kind of no reason that restaking has to be limited to the unit of account of Ether, right? You could restake USDC. Like all of these things are just kind of like collateral that's being used as economic security in different places and being deployed to slashing conditions and AVSs. So, you could imagine a version where you have like some yield-bearing USDC thing that's deployed into an AVS and you want to withdraw that. You might have other kind of withdrawal rate limiting mechanisms on that regard too. So, yeah, kind of just a lot going on here. The key takeaway is just that complexity compounds, and the real nightmare situation is that either a mass slashing or a crisis of confidence leads to this liquidity crunch, right? And this is what we saw when, not exactly what we saw, but when the unwind happened of 3 arrows and everything, and stETH depegged, like a lot of stuff started hitting the fan because a bunch of people were levered up on the stETH ETH peg holding. So any sort of situation where one of these LRTs gets very big and something underneath it like breaks is just going to lead to kind of a nightmare for someone. And I expect some people to lose sleep over it, I guess. And yeah, I think these plots kind of captured some of the mania that we're seeing right now, which is that, once EigenLayer kind of pulled the cork on the caps for how much can get restaked, like stuff just went absolutely hyperbolic. So it's kind of hard to see, but this is the start of when EigenLayer launched, so July 2023. And then this is the start of this year, 2024. And you see like this is basically when they pulled the plug on limiting stuff, and it just straight up to like 7-8 billion. And then LRTs are just like complete up and to the right in terms of TVL. They're at like, 3 or 4 billion, changing every day by huge amounts. So yeah, I guess just hope that these 2 talks have kind of illustrated some of the risks. That's really what we're trying to highlight here, and kind of look at these things along a bunch of different axes and say like, where's the risk on this axis? Where's the risk on this axis? Where's the risk on this axis? But yeah, overall, I think it's really exciting that the LRT space is getting so much attention, and hopefully there's lots of exciting products built on top. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
I love so much that Renzo is here. I want to hear Renzo's thoughts about the rates of error strategy to mitigate.
Do we want to do Q&A or do we?
I don't want to be on the spot right now.
I'm looking at Tarun and I'm like,
Okay.
We can do a little Q&A. Yeah.
Quick question, like for example, if for LRT, right? if they have different withdrawal time, how we do the sort of calculation on that. Yeah. For example, if the users basically need to withdraw twice, right? Need to wait for the LRT withdrawal from this sort of the validation on the AGS, right? And then after that, the user will probably further to wait for.
So I guess there's a couple answers to that.
Yeah.
So first is they definitely have to do both, and as he was mentioning, there's a cash management component to any of these things. Think of these like these bond funds, where like they have to have cash on hand for redemption, so they don't stake everything. So you know, you're losing some yield for that. But the second thing is, I think once 7002, if it gets in, then you can actually start doing with the allowable exits. You can actually do lending against withdrawal positions. So there's a bunch of people trying to do lending protocols where there's a withdrawal position, and I basically, I'm willing to take the duration risk, and I front you capital to take your withdrawal queue, because once I have the forced exit, I can transfer it to you. So it's kind of ironic that 7002 is about, hey, I don't have to get stuck in AVS, but it actually enables a lot of crazy lending protocols for making this withdrawal stuff easier.
Yeah, and can just comment a little bit on 7002. So right now, it's almost like a weird artifact of how Ethereum was like built, which is there's kind of two keys that control the stake, right? There's the BLS key, which runs the validator and signs the like attestations and signs the blocks. And then there's the EOA, which is the address that actually controls like where the ETH is sent to after it's withdrawn. So 7002 just allows that second address, the EOA, or the second set of keys that controls the EOA, to do the withdrawal on behalf of the BLS key. So because really like whoever owns the withdrawal credential owns the capital, it's just the BLS key that's doing the like actual labor involved in the staking. So yeah, in some ways not having the EOA able to do the withdrawal now limits the set of things that can happen, because you have to trust an exit to be signed by the BLS key in the case of, like Lido for right now, if a bunch of people want to withdraw, they have to like basically ask nicely to the validators to withdraw, which is kind of like this weird situation.
No, so this is the nice thing for once you're liquid is you can use lending protocols to fulfill this. For AVSs, we're not at that point. That do that management. But the duration mismatch is usually filled by these hedging products, like a lending protocol.
Thank you.
I have a question here, because yesterday we have a guest talking about the index of LRT. I don't know, do you think it introduce more risk, or it can reduce?
Every 10 years, someone has to make a new CDO, right?
I think they all start to kind of look like the same product, right? Which is, I think, what people expect to happen to LSTs too, right? Like if there's an LRT or a specific AVS even, just one AVS that actually generates like a ton of real yield, then the LSTs, like if they're seeing huge outflows, they're gonna have to just like build that into their product, right? So I think in some sense, all of these things are gonna start looking quite similar, which is just matching like capital to labor and using that capital, like liquefying that capital in some way, right?
But to the point of withdrawing in LSTs, there's still going to be some latent floor demand for I don't think they're going to completely wholesale change. There's going to be some demand to exit.
Yeah, there's also just innovator's dilemma, right? Like Lido incorporating anything here is hard because it's almost like them killing their golden goose potentially. Because what they do now is super simple. Right. I mean, they do a really good job of it, but it's quite simple in terms of just using the Ethereum protocol and making it more smooth. But we'll see.
Are you guys gonna post this in the blog?
It is already published.
Live? Okay.
As of yesterday.
Great.
It was a bit of a buzzer beater.
Look, sometimes having a deadline is a good thing.
Is it possible for LRT protocol try to keep a stable return, but because it has duration constraints?
That's a good question. Well, it depends on what the yield sources are. If the yield sources are points, no. The volatility on these points trading, implied trading spreads are insane. Walter has a talk about that from yesterday about like what, the Pendle and gearbox stuff is a little too crazy. But I think once people understand what types of fees AVSs generate, then it'll be a lot easier. Like the zeroth order approximation is, hey, AVSs, this aggregation of fees is just mainly some percentage of roll-up fees across all roll-ups plus some percentage of MEV. Like let's take that as like the base. If you believe that, then you could imagine trying to make something that stabilizes. But the real question is, no one knows what the real fee distribution of AVSs are, and most of their fees are coming from variable fees, plus maybe dual token subsidies. But those are, that trade-off. It's like you can't know a priori. I mean, that's why the points markets are ridiculous. they're betting on those fees.
What kind of AVS, if you like, can sort of absorb these 2 billion TVL from?
Shared sequencers? I mean, it's like an L1, right? Like at that point, I don't know.
But what kind of APY, if you like, is?
Well, what rollups are generating a lot of fees? Base? I feel like go look at Base's daily fees on
I see.
I think the rollup fees are the highest. The proving networks are probably second. And then I don't know what other AVSs we don't think that are like MEV auction type stuff. I think will eventually move to something that looks like restaking versus what is now.
But once you use all DA, the sequencing fee is super low.
Yes. That's true. It does turn the shared sequencer into a Solana validator.
Yeah, another weird thing about the AVSs is they might they're kind of like looking for buyers and sellers, right? So they need to match some amount of economic security with some amount of yield. And if they have like a ton of sellers of economic security but no buyers, then like the yields are just the real yields are just gonna be so small. And so they might like actually rate limit. So there might be like a race to the entrance to get into like hot AVSs. I don't know.
I think the proving networks have real fee generation potential at some point. But
When is some point?
Not tomorrow.
Any more questions? Okay. Could there be more MEV coming from LRT?
Definitely. I feel like the lending stuff we're just talking about, that will like create a whole game for them.
And a whole new set of pools to ARB, right?
Yeah.
Like so many pools to ARB.
There's also actually a question that I've been kind of thinking a little bit about LRTs doing, is LRTs doing withdrawals directly to rollups versus mainnet and like the spread between the two. Right now, I think that, I don't know, Lucas, you're right, never mind.
This is his problem.
You're trying to get money in?
Yeah, it's fair. But I think there will be a lot of MEV from that. Like the withdrawal to L2 versus withdrawal to mainnet.
Lucas has like had from really to there. Okay. Any more questions from the audience? If no, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.